Hello, class, and Dr. Ellis. I hope you all are having a great week. The novel I chose to complete my genogram on is Song of Solomon, written by Toni Morrison. Song of Solomon explores the quest for cultural identity. I first want to discuss and do a breakdown of the genogram itself before getting into the book summary. So you will see in the Word document that I have created the genogram for the book Song of Solomon. It starts with Solomon and Rina. They have a child, Jake, or Make-em-Dead the First. Make-em-Dead the First ends up marrying Singbird. Original name is Singing Bird. She is the daughter of Hetty Bird. Hetty Bird had another child, Crowell Bird, they call him Crow, who also had a daughter named Susan Bird. There's not really much mentioned in the text about these individuals, but it is important that they were included. So Make-em-Dead the First and Singbird had two children, Make-em-Dead Jr. and Polite. We later learned that they did become estranged from each other, so that is shown in the genogram. On Polite's side, she had a very distant and poor relationship with a man they called Island Man. He ended up leaving Polite and she became single, so the distant poor resembles that as well. They had one child named Reba. Reba had a child named Hagar that we learned later on was deceased in the book. It is unknown who Hagar's dad was, so that's something that isn't included because it was not mentioned in the novel. On Make-em-Dead Jr.'s side, he was married to Ruth. They are married, but they did have a very distant and poor relationship. He was abusive to Ruth and kind of held the title of man of the house a little bit too strongly. Ruth Foster was the daughter of Dr. Foster, which was the first African American doctor in the town of Michigan that the story is set in. Ruth and Make-em-Dead Jr., they have three children. Magdalena, born in 1918, she was called Lena throughout the story. 1 Corinthians, called Corinthia, was also born in 1918. They were the same age. And then last, Make-em-Dead the Third, which we know him or learned to know him as Milkman, was born in 1932. Milkman and Hagar are connected because you will learn later in my book summary, and if you read the text, Milkman and Hagar did have a romantic relationship with one another, although they were cousins. So, kind of want to get into my book summary. This 15 chapter 2-part text was written in 1977 and follows the life of the protagonist, Make-em-Dead III, better known as Milkman, an African American man living in Michigan from birth. Milkman was the first African American born in Mercy Hospital to his mother Ruth Foster and father Make-em-Dead Jr., like we see in the genogram. Make-em-Dead Jr. is the son of Make-em-Dead, who was killed in front of his two children, Make-em-Dead Jr. and Polite, while defending his land. After the murder of their father, Make-em and Polite then became estranged from each other, and although they did live in the same town, Make-em-Dead assumes that his sister, who is poor and now single, will affect his social position in his town as a landlord. Throughout the beginning of the text, we see where Milkman becomes estranged from himself, his family, and his community. Although Milkman did grow up nourished by his mother, his aunt, Polite, and his two sisters, shown in the genogram, he grew up bothered, privileged, and lacked compassion. He became very bored with life at a young age. We see as young as 4 years old, he became bored with life and becomes a ruthless landlord who seeks an accumulation of wealth as he gets older, just like his father. Milkman is first affected by his genetics when he is afflicted with an emotional disease that has its origins in past generations and are also passed on to future generations. His grandfather, Macon I, also experienced this disease. Throughout both parts of this novel, Milkman embarks on a journey that helps him understand his culture and his own identity, as well as the past generations that he comes from, with the help of his aunt, Polite, and best friend, Guitar. We'll see later on that there's some betrayal here for both characters, Polite and Guitar Baines. Part 1, which is chapters 1 through 9, is set in a town of Michigan and traces Milkman's life from birth to the age 32, while focused on his spiritually empty, aimless life as a young man caught between his father's materialistic lifestyle and his Aunt Polite's traditional values that she believed he should follow. Even at age 4, Milkman becomes very bored with life and seeks more, like we mentioned above. So he kind of goes out and determines what his journey is going to be. We learn of most of the characters in Part 1 with flashbacks, including information regarding Milkman's grandfather and Macon Dead Jr.'s father. This is where we learn of the death and the estrangement between Macon Dead Jr. and his sister Polite. We also learn in Part 1, like I mentioned in the genogram, Milkman has a romantic relationship with his cousin Hagar. Part 1 concludes with Milkman's decision to leave Michigan in search of Polite's gold that his father believed she hid in one of the houses she lived in prior to moving to Michigan. Like I mentioned before, he loved wealth. He sought wealth wherever he went. Of course, this is after Milkman already tried to rob Polite after everything she had done for him growing up. So that's a little bit of the betrayal that I mentioned before with Polite. Part 2, which is chapters 10 through 15, begins with Milkman's arrival in Pennsylvania. This is where his paternal grandfather, Macon Dead First, and Singbird had built a prosperous farm for the family. This is the same farm that Milkman's grandfather lost his life for. I mentioned before he was murdered trying to save his land. This was the land he was trying to save. And Milkman truly believed that the gold was going to be on the farm, since it was such a big part of the past for his family. When Milkman is unable to find the gold in the farm, he begins getting frustrated, but he also decides to not give up, and he continues his search for the inheritance. He traces his ancestry all the way back to the fictional town of Schlamar, Virginia, where he meets his father's people and discovers the true spiritual meaning of his inheritance. So basically, he found his father's side of the family and learned more about himself, as well as the inheritance that he believed he should have. Like I mentioned before, there is some betrayal, and the novel actually ends with the death of Hagar, the death of Polite, and the betrayal of Guitar Baines against Milkman. Guitar Baines betrayed Milkman because he wanted the gold that was found. He wanted the inheritance after Milkman had promised him a portion of it. He got a little greedy and wanted all of it. And Guitar Baines is actually the one who murdered Paulette. He shot her with a gun right in front of Milkman, and then Milkman knew pretty much that Guitar would probably shoot him too, but the novel ends without actually explaining whether or not Milkman had died as well. In the end, everything sort of circled back to his grandfather, Milkman's grandfather, which I believe had a very significant amount of effect in Milkman and his journey through life. We see that not only did he get a genetic disease from his family, and which his grandfather also had, like I mentioned before, the wealth and the inheritance is kind of what shaped his life, and that inheritance came from his grandfather, which was left to Polite. And Milkman's father didn't believe that Polite, who was very poor, should keep that inheritance hidden from the family, even from herself, because she was so poor. So it's kind of a lose-lose situation for Polite throughout the book, but in the end, Milkman does get his inheritance, and he does find more out about his self and his identity and his culture, and what his purpose is in life. So I just want to include that there is a key in the genogram for anyone who would like to understand the lines a little bit more specifically. You can follow the key and understand why they are connected to who and what. If there's anything anyone would like to add, I would be glad to hear of that information. Just feel free to shoot me an email or whatever you prefer. Send me a message in Canvas. It doesn't really matter. So I do want to thank you guys for listening to my presentation, and I really hope you enjoyed it. I actually really enjoyed this text. It was something I did not expect to have to do, and so when I learned of the assignment and I read the text, chose which text I would want to read, I had actually heard of this book before. So I would suggest this text to others. It's very informative and very helpful if you kind of are at loss with trying to find your cultural identity. So again, I want to thank you guys for listening. I hope you all guys have a great week. Good luck on your own genograms and your own assignments. I will say that Word document was not very easy to put together, so I really hope y'all enjoyed that, and it is easy to follow. Again, like I said, thanks for listening, and goodbye.